Welcome to the next installment in my video lecture series for macroeconomics. And in this particular video, we're going to take a look at the long run aggregate supply curve. And the most important thing to remember about the long run aggregate supply curve is that it's vertical at the full employment output level. So that's a key thing to remember. It's vertical, and that the income level that's associated with where it's vertical is the full employment output level. So in the short run, we are going to have the intersection of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. That is going to be the short run equilibrium. But in the long run, you cannot deviate from the long run aggregate supply curve, which is vertical at the full employment output level. So make sure you remember that the income level associated with where aggregate supply is vertical is the full employment output level. But let's take a look at what can occur if, for example, we stimulate aggregate demand in this situation here to see what long-run changes actually occur. So if we stimulate the aggregate demand curve, we see that the aggregate demand curve has shifted to the right. Here is the original aggregate demand curve, and here is the new aggregate demand curve. So the government has, let's say, stimulated the economy and stimulated aggregate demand, which causes it to shift to the right. And you can see in the short run, we can actually have an output level which is greater than the full employment output level. You can see here that by doing this, we've actually caused income levels to increase past the full employment output level, and we've also caused a bit of inflation. The price level has increased because we've stimulated aggregate demand. But what's going to be the reaction in the marketplace, and what's going to occur in the long run? So we've stimulated aggregate demand. This has caused the price level and aggregate income to increase. But in the long run, companies and firms that are producing items are going to react to the higher price level. All right. So one of the things that's going to occur is, in order to stimulate output past the full employment output / income level, is that wages are going to be pushed upward. In order to get more people to work, you're going to have to increase the wage rate to pull people that are not in the labor force and get them to enter into the labor force. And the only way you can induce them to do this is by increasing the wage rate. So firms are going to end up seeing higher wages because of the stimulus to aggregate demand. And in the long run, what's going to happen is they're going to face higher costs of doing business. So their reaction is going to be to restrict aggregate supply. So the aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the left. The reason for this is because we stimulated the economy past the full employment level, we placed upward pressure on prices, including wages. So wages are going to start creeping upward, and firms are going to react to this by restricting supply. So the aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the left. And let me redo this so this is more appropriate. That's aggregate supply 1. So aggregate supply 1 is the new aggregate supply curve after firms react to higher input costs, including wages. So the aggregate supply curve will shift to the left until we get back to where the aggregate demand curve 1 intersects the long run aggregate supply curve. So what happens is, in the short run, we've stimulated output past the full employment level and caused a bit of inflation. The reaction to this from firms is they're going to restrict their output. The aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the left. So what will happen is we will return back to the full employment output level. But in doing this, we actually see that prices move further upward. So in the short run, it is possible for the government to stimulate aggregate demand so that we have an output level that is greater than the full employment output level. But the long-run adjustment in the market is going to be that firms will restrict their output, aggregate supply will shift to the left, we will return back to the full employment output level, but at a much higher price level. So in the long run, the only thing we've managed to accomplish by stimulating aggregate demand in this situation is to cause inflation. So make sure you realize that in the short run, it is possible to have an output level and income level that is above the full employment output level. But in doing this, we end up causing inflation. In the long run, firms will react to those higher prices, the higher input prices, the higher wages, etc., and they will restrict aggregate supply. So the aggregate supply curve will shift to the left, And the only thing that we end up accomplishing is we are still at the full employment output level, but we see that the price level increases from P0 to P2. Meaning that in doing this, the policy in the long run, all it accomplishes is being inflationary.